October 1942. Station 105, Chelston Airfield, England. The surgical tent smelled of ether and cold iron. Another stretcher came in. Another wounded navigator, his flight jacket torn open, his chest peppered with shrapnel. Colonel Malcolm Cummings Grow bent over the table, hand steady, eyes tired but sharp beneath the lamp. German flak had done its work again. Metal fragments that sliced through leather and flesh as if neither mattered. He'd seen it too many times now. Each wound told a story. The angle of entry, the depth, the way the fragments slowed just enough to kill, but not to pass through. He noticed the pattern. Low-velocity projectiles, the remnants of anti-aircraft shells that burst around the B-17s at 20,000 feet. Outside, engines coughed as another bomber limped home across the channel. The groan of trucks, the wail of an ambulance, every sound carried its own arithmetic of pain. 70%. That was the number that haunted him. Nearly 70% of the casualties he treated shared the same signature wounds, flak fragments, jagged, tumbling through air after the shells burst, cutting through bombers and men alike. He finished the operation. The young navigator would live. This one, at least. Grow removed his gloves, stared at the blood on his hands, and made a decision that would change the mathematics of aerial warfare forever. These wounds were preventable. The technology to stop them already existed, had existed for centuries. Someone just had to ask the right question, in the right place, in the right time. The story of those unprotected crews began that summer, August 17, 1942. The 97th Bomb Group launched the first American heavy bomber mission of the war. 18 B-17s rolled across the Channel toward Rouen-Sotteville in occupied France. Major Paul Tibbets led the strike. 12 bombers on the main target, 6 flying diversion. They all came back that day. It looked easy, deceptively easy. But as the autumn deepened and the 8th Air Force pushed deeper into the heart of Hitler's Reich, the optimism drained away. Casualty reports grew heavier than the bombs they dropped. The statistics told a grim truth that no one had predicted. Military planners had expected German fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, to be the main threat, their machine guns, their cannon fire. But the data said otherwise. 70% of all wounds came not from bullets, but from fragments, from flak, from pieces of the aircraft itself, blown apart by the black bursts that blossomed in the cold European sky. The Germans had perfected their anti-aircraft art. Flug ab der Kanonen, flak. Thousands of guns ringed every target worth hitting. The standard 88mm cannon hurled shells up to 30,000 feet. each one timed to explode at altitude, scattering hundreds of razor-edge shards across the bomber formations. And those fragments, they didn't travel fast, not anymore. They tumbled, lost their velocity, but still hit hard enough to tear a man apart. Grow, being a surgeon, saw what that meant. He didn't think in abstract numbers. He thought in tissue and trajectory. Chest wounds, abdominal wounds. The data confirmed it. 36% of deaths from the chest, 39% from the abdomen. 3/4 of all fatalities were shots to the body's core. Protect the torso, and you protect the man. But there was a problem. The Army Air Forces had no armor program. None. Personal armor had been tried in the last war, steel vests for infantry. But they were too heavy, too stiff, too slow. Soldiers needed to move. Planes were a different world. Bomber crews didn't run, they endured. They sat in cramped positions, oxygen masks freezing to their faces, surrounded by glass and metal at sub-zero temperatures. They didn't need to sprint. They needed to survive. Grow saw it clearly. What was deadly to an infantryman, weight, might be bearable for a flyer. He imagined a vest, something flexible, overlapping plates like the old brigandines of the Middle Ages. Not thick steel, just enough to catch the fragments, the slower bits that flak turned loose. A fragment traveling 500 to maybe 1,000 feet per second could be stopped by a few millimeters of good steel. So, in October 1942, he wrote the proposal, sent it up the chain. His sketches showed a vest of small overlapping plates sewn into fabric. He cited the casualty data, the wound analysis, the trajectory studies. The response came back lukewarm, almost dismissive. Too heavy, they said. Too complicated. Crews already carried 40 pounds of gear, oxygen, parachutes, heavy flight suits. Why add more? Others argued, just give them better fighters. Escorts will save them. Grow didn't argue. He persisted. He proposed a simple field test, just a few dozen vests issued to volunteer crews. Let the numbers speak. Headquarters finally agreed, with one condition. He had to find someone else to make them. The Army Air Forces had no spare factories for armor. So Grow turned to the British. The Royal Air Force had already tried something similar, but their bombers, the Avro Lancasters, were too cramped for bulky protection. Their armor experiments had been abandoned as impractical. But the Americans' B-17s, their B-24s, they had just enough room to make it possible.
The British put Grow in touch with an unlikely partner, the Wilkinson Sword Company. Yes, the same firm that had made officers' sabers, bayonets, and razors since the 18th century. Founded in 1772, Wilkinson had once forged armor for Victorian officers, even bulletproof vests for colonial wars. By the Second World War, they made aircraft fire suppression systems, but their craftsmen still knew the language of steel. Imagine it, an American surgeon walking into a British sword factory to build the future of body armor. In October 1942, Grow arrived at Wilkinson's London works with his sketches and medical data in hand. There, across drawing tables scarred by centuries of craft, the partnership began. Grow brought anatomy and wound ballistics. Wilkinson brought metallurgy and the art of shaping metal that flexes instead of shattering. They worked side by side, adjusting, re-sewing, hammering, testing. Each iteration a little lighter, a little stronger, a little closer to the balance between survival and burden. The final design took shape by winter. 3 pieces, a vest for chest and back, an apron for the lower abdomen and groin, and a third add-on for special positions like the ball turret gunner who hung below the plane in a glass bubble of death. Each vest carried hundreds of small squares of manganese steel, 2 inches across, just 1 millimeter thick, sewn into heavy canvas with a soft cotton backing. Overlapping like scales, they gave flexibility without leaving gaps. Manganese steel, tough enough to stop a fragment, yet light enough to wear. The whole thing weighed 22 pounds, manageable, survivable. It even had a quick release, red cords that when pulled would strip the armor away in seconds, because if your plane was on fire and you had to bail out, you couldn't afford dead weight. By early 1943, Wilkinson had finished the prototypes. Crews received them quietly, almost skeptically. But when the first wounded men came in wearing armor that had stopped fragments, when surgeons found shards of flak embedded in those little steel squares, but not in flesh, the tide began to turn. Word spread fast through the 8th Air Force. The vests worked. But there weren't enough. Wilkinson could make maybe 100 a month, far too few for the thousands of airmen flying daily into the Reich. That's when Grow took his idea home, to America. This was where the story would move beyond medicine, beyond metallurgy. It would reach into art itself. When Malcolm Grow returned to Washington in early 1943, he carried more than a prototype. He carried proof. The vest had worked. Fragments that once shredded flesh now stopped cold against sheets of manganese steel no thicker than a coin. The idea had crossed an ocean and survived the skepticism of generals and engineers alike. But now came the hardest part, turning invention into production. The Army Air Forces needed thousands of them. Wilkinson Sword could not possibly meet that demand, not with British industry already stretched thin by its own war. America had the factories, the materials, the manpower, but it also had bureaucracy, contracts, and red tape that could strangle an idea before it ever reached the front line. Grow went knocking on doors, manufacturers, steel companies, textile suppliers, one after another. Some listened politely, others turned away. The war economy ran on priorities, and nobody had flak vests on their list. Bombers, bullets, tanks, those were urgent. Armor for men, that was still considered secondary. Until one name appeared on a memorandum: the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Yes, that museum. It sounds absurd, but the logic was perfect. The Met's Department of Arms and Armor was the only place in America that still employed experts in medieval plate design, chainmail, and protective metalwork. Their curator, Dr. Bashford Dean, had designed helmets for the U.S. Army in the First World War. Though Dean had died in 1928, his department lived on, staffed by metallurgists and historians who understood the ancient science of protection better than anyone alive. Grow met with the curator then in charge, Helmut Nickel, a quiet scholar who'd spent his life studying the balance between weight, flexibility, and defense. Grow showed him the Wilkinson vest, laid it out across a table once used to display suits of armor from the Crusades. Nickel ran his hand across the overlapping plates, nodded slowly, and smiled. He understood at once. In a single afternoon, the past and the future of armor met under the same roof. The museum agreed to assist in refining the design for mass production. Their laboratories could test metals, measure fragment resistance, and optimize the balance between coverage and mobility. The scientists and curators, men more used to preserving relics than building war gear, now found themselves drafting blueprints for something that would soon save thousands of lives. The tests were brutal and exacting. Using captured German flak shells, the team simulated explosions at range, firing fragments into test mannequins fitted with the Wilkinson armor. The results were conclusive. The plates stopped 98% of the low-velocity fragments under combat conditions. But manganese steel, though strong, was still heavy and difficult to shape. The Met's metallurgists proposed an alternative, an alloy known as Hadfield steel, developed decades earlier but rarely used in clothing applications. It offered greater toughness with a slight reduction in weight. The American version of the flak vest would be based on that refinement. The project was transferred to the Army Air Force's Engineering Division for scale-up. Grow oversaw the process personally, traveling between Washington and Dayton, Ohio, where the Army Air Force's Materiel Command managed development. At Dayton, engineers adapted the Wilkinson pattern to fit American production methods. They replaced some hand stitching with machine seams, standardized plate sizes for quicker assembly, and used lightweight duck canvas instead of the heavy British weave. Each vest was still made by hand, but now production could be measured in hundreds per month instead of dozens. The name given to the new armor was simple: Type A2 flak suit. The first shipments went out in spring 1943 to the 8th Air Force in England. Crews received them eagerly, not because they were comfortable, they weren't, but because the rumors had spread. Men who had once dismissed the idea as cumbersome now lined up to be issued one. Word had circulated through the bomber groups. They work, they save you. At Thorpe Abbotts, home of the 100th Bomb Group, a waist gunner named William Jones remembered his first mission wearing the vest. He said it felt like wearing a furnace door, heavy and stiff, but after that day he swore he'd never fly without it. A piece of shrapnel had hit him dead center in the chest. It should have killed him. Instead, it dented the plate, cracked a rib, and left a bruise. He finished the mission and lived to tell the tale. Across England, surgeons began to notice a shift. The number of fatal chest and abdominal wounds dropped sharply among crews who wore armor. Casualty reports confirmed what Grow had hoped. The vest reduced flak-related deaths by nearly 70%. Still, it wasn't perfect. The vest didn't cover the shoulders or upper arms, and fragments could still enter through the neck or sides. But it turned what had once been instant death into survivable injury. For the first time, bomber crews began to feel they had a fighting chance. The project gained official recognition. The 8th Air Force praised Grow's persistence, and production ramped up across several U.S. plants. Each vest cost about $70 to make, expensive for a single piece of gear, but priceless to the men who depended on it. By mid-1943, flak suits became standard issue for air crews flying over occupied Europe. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, each adapted the vest differently. Pilots cut off the apron for comfort in the seat. Waist gunners wore the full set, including the groin panel. Ball turret gunners, suspended in their tiny spheres beneath the plane, wore the complete configuration with added padding for insulation. Even so, no one ever called it comfortable. Crews sweated inside them, cursed the weight, and complained of limited movement. But they kept wearing them because they had seen what happened to those who didn't. In debriefing tents after missions, vests were laid out like relics. Men pointed to the dents, the gouges, the embedded shards of steel. They passed them around, showing where death had stopped an inch away. Some painted names on them, or tally marks for missions flown. They became more than equipment. They became a kind of talisman. Grow's concept had not only saved lives, it had changed morale. For the first time, bomber crews no longer felt like helpless targets in a sky filled with invisible knives. They had armor, and with it came a measure of control, however small, against the chaos of flak. But as the air war expanded, Italy, North Africa, the Pacific, the vest had to evolve once again. The conditions changed, the missions changed, and so did the enemy. By late 1943, the skies over Europe were turning into something far beyond strategy or tactics. They had become a crucible of endurance. The men of the 8th Air Force flew mission after mission into the black blossoms of flak, through clouds of smoke and fire that reached up from the cities below. They learned to count the bursts the way infantry counted footsteps. The rhythm of flak was its own terrible heartbeat. 5 seconds between the flash and the bang. Then another. Then another. Every man knew the sound of fragments rattling against the fuselage like hail. They knew the shudder in the airframe when a piece struck home. But now they also knew the hard thump of a fragment hitting armor and stopping there. For the first time, survival wasn't just luck, it was design. The flak suit, as everyone called it now, became part of the bomber's identity. It was there in every cockpit, every gunner's position. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And in war, that was beauty enough. Still, the skies demanded evolution. In 1944, as missions reached deeper into Germany, Berlin, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, the intensity of anti-aircraft fire doubled. Groh and his engineers studied the after-action reports. They began experimenting with newer configurations, heavier plates in the front, lighter ones at the sides, segmented panels that could be replaced in the field. Then came a second version, the Type A3, a little lighter, a little better balanced, designed for longer missions. The men called it the Groh suit, half in jest, half in gratitude. In England, the Royal Air Force adopted their own variant. The two allies now shared not just tactics, but technology, and the quiet understanding that a surgeon's insight had reshaped the way men went to war. Across the Atlantic, in factories from New Jersey to California, women sewed steel into fabric by the thousands. They worked long shifts, not knowing the faces of the men who would wear their work, but believing, as Groh did, that every plate they stitched might be the one that stopped a fragment, the one that sent someone home alive. By the time D-Day came in June 1944, flak suits were everywhere. Every bomber crew, every mission, every flight jacket carried that same dull weight against the chest, a reminder of both danger and hope.
Surgeons began to see something new, not just fewer fatalities, but faster recoveries. Wounds that once ended careers now healed. Men who once would have been buried were instead sent back to fly again or home to their families. Statistically, the survival rate for bomber crews rose sharply. Spiritually, something else happened. The armor became a symbol, a quiet promise that even amid the machinery of death, someone had cared enough to protect them. When the war finally ended in 1945, the factories shut down and the last shipments of flak vests were crated and stored. The world moved on to new conflicts, new technologies, and new armor: Kevlar, ceramics, composites. The Wilkinson vests became relics, Displayed in museums and air bases, their once bright plates dulled with age. But the idea, simple, stubborn, human, lived on. Every piece of modern body armor traces its lineage back to that cold October tent in 1942, to a surgeon who refused to accept that 70% of wounds were inevitable. Malcolm Grow went on to become the first Surgeon General of the U.S. Air Force. The flak vest, his most enduring legacy, became the foundation of every protective system used by airmen and soldiers since. And somewhere in the archives of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the original prototype still rests, canvas faded, steel scarred, but intact. A reminder that art and science, history and humanity once joined hands in a moment of war to save lives. When people talk about the great inventions of the Second World War, they mention radar, the jet engine, the atom bomb. But there's another kind of invention, one born not from ambition, but from compassion. A surgeon looked at wounds and saw patterns. He saw suffering, and he decided to change the math. And because of that, tens of thousands of men came home who otherwise never would have. Sometimes progress doesn't roar like engines or shine like victory parades. Sometimes it's quiet. It's a man in a tent washing blood from his hands, thinking there has to be a better way, and then making one. That's where real heroism hides, not in the medals or the headlines, but in the small, stubborn acts of care that ripple through history long after the war is over. And so the story of the flak vest ends not in battle, but in peace, with lives saved, lessons learned, and a silent gratitude carried through generations. Because every time a pilot climbs into armor today, every time a soldier straps on protection before heading into danger, Malcolm Grow's question still echoes quietly through the years. Can we save just one more?